Please welcome with me Mei Lin Neo. Dr. Mei Lin is a marine ecologist whose research focuses on the use of experimental approaches to studying the interactions of marine organisms with the marine environment. Leveraging on her research work, Mei Lin aims to generate robust scientific data to support marine conservation and management of endangered species. In particular, she has been enamored with the giant clams as her model species for the past decade and remained steadfast in her mission to champion of their conservation in Singapore and the region. More recently, she has been working on the issue of marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia, focused on understanding the status of research in this region. Mei Lin is also an avid science communicator of marine conservation issues in Singapore. She believes that science needs to be accessible to the public for it to generate societal awareness and impact. Mei Lin's works has also appeared in a highly popular TED Talk, The Fascinating Secret of the Giant Clams, has received over than 1.2 million views. Please welcome with me Mei Lin Neo.
Everyone, good morning. So give me a while before I set it up. I'm honored to be invited here today to be part of the Imagination Week to share about my career as a marine scientist working in Singapore. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Xavier, understanding that he's also not in person here today, for this invitation, as well as Anne and Suling for arranging this presentation. So let's kickstart with today's talk by diving straight into my career as a marine biologist. So myself, I'm born and raised in Singapore, and I completed all of my education in the local institutions. So over the last 15 years, I have been studying the marine life living just right here in Singapore waters. Some of the questions that I have asked in my research includes how the marine animals are doing in the sea, how some of the human activities such as fishing and shipping affect marine life, and also how marine species may be related to one another. And as I learned more about what threatens marine life, I started to use what I learned from my research to advocate for their conservation and management so that we can actually better protect them in the long term. And one such animal that I have been studying and championing for their conservation is the giant clam that you see here, which is also my favorite animal. So there are many reasons that have inspired me to eventually pursue a career in marine science and conservation. So it first started out as a genuine curiosity about Mother Nature and how things work in the environment. But with time, it became a passion where I dove deeper into the science of the environment, specifically when I was studying the giant clams. So through this period working as a marine scientist, I also discovered the purpose of my work, which is using my voice to communicate science and champion for marine conservation. And finally, having all the perseverance to keep myself going, being patient for the results, and celebrating the small wins at each step along the way. So this is not a stepwise process, as you can see in this arrow, but rather it is actually a process of embracing all these traits in motivating me to chase after a career in marine science. So I talked about curiosity, passion, purpose, and perseverance have kept me on this path to becoming a marine scientist. And as a scientist myself, I strongly believe that scientific research is very important in making discoveries and advancement that will allow us to have progress in the environment and society. So the new information and results that we get from scientific research can be used to empower communities to rethink their relationships with the oceans. So this information, this science is only effective when we can translate them into usable bite-sized information for the wider public and general audience. And therefore, communicating the science is equally important in driving positive actions for marine conservation. So these are some of the reasons why scientists should talk about science, or everyone should talk about science as well. I see it as a form of giving back to the society, apart from the fact that a lot of our research funding comes from the public sectors like the government and public, sharing our scientific information can be viewed as a social responsibility to inform society of what's going on. We can help shape attitudes by sharing knowledge. And we know that knowledge is a powerful tool that can influence mindsets. It can also help to build up support for science and promote its understanding to the wider relevance of the society. We can also use science to help build public trust, especially raising the value and importance of accurate science. And when people can access science, they can actually trust it much better because they can easily understood and interpret it. And finally, something that's very closely related to what has been going on all over the world in the past few years is how can we combat fake news? How can we prevent the spread of disinformation and then without causing community scares? So individuals we can actually inform public members on how to actually follow a diversity of news sources and also be skeptical to some extent of what they read and watch on their feed. So science itself is an extraordinary and essential institution. It continues to thrive after centuries of human ingenuity and effort, and to provide significant advancements for societal well-being in areas such as understanding and mitigating global environmental change, achieving innovations for improving public health, and creating technological solutions to widespread societal challenges. But again, sadly, a lot of the science still remains very poorly communicated, especially because many of them are published papers, and these published papers are also behind what we call paywalls, meaning that you have to pay to get access to science. And in fact, actually, communication between scientists is also very urgently needed as well. So how can we inform, educate, and raise awareness of science-related topics among general public and a non-expert audience? So in this next part of my talk, I'll showcase the research projects that I have been involved and hopefully be able to illustrate how I have moved the science beyond words on papers. So these are the three projects that I'll be talking about. So the first one that we'll dive into is the giant clam conservation. So I mentioned earlier that it's one of the first animals that I have studied, and I spent the bulk of my career dedicating the time to studying this shellfish called the giant clams. So as the name suggests, they are the world's largest living shellfish in the sea. So the largest species can grow up to 1 meter long and weigh over 250 kgs. So in the coral reefs, they do support and provide ecological services. And to the coastal communities, they are also of social and cultural importance, especially in the form of food and also the materials, especially in the shells. Presently, they are globally threatened from overfishing, pollution, and climate change. And this is why the main part of my work is how do I come up with ideas and solutions to their conservation. And we know that the conservation requires a holistic approach of engaging coastal communities to work together to protect them, to better protect them in the long term. So the giant clam was my very first research topic when I started back in 2006 as an undergraduate. So eventually, when I did my PhD in 2009, I was met with some challenges. So many of the senior colleagues in my field, they actually told me that you won't find any giant clams around Singapore waters as they are very rare, and basically implied that it would not be a good PhD topic for me. So although I was slightly worried at that time, I wanted to still give it a try. I was undeterred, and I thought that I should at least go out and see it for myself, whether our seashores hosted any giant clams. To my pleasant surprise, we had made very good headway into the research of giant clams in Singapore. So it turns out that it was a relatively good PhD topic, even though there are different challenges around it. And I successfully completed my PhD, which now still serves as the first baselines of giant clam status in Singapore. And it became the foundation work that fed into the major restocking programs that took place from 2011 and 2018. So during my PhD, I tried to answer one of these key questions, which is why should others care about them, and what can we do to pay more attention to their story? So earlier on, I talked about my PhD work and everything. So at the end of it, I was wondering, how do I get people to care about this animal that does not have googly eyes and is not cuddly, is not furry, it may not be very appealing like the tigers and the rhinos and the pandas. So one of my missions was to find out through science, what are the potential ecological roles and functions that they have on coral reefs, and also to learn of their cultural significance to various coastal communities. So on coral reefs, giant clams are what I call ecosystem engineers, where they serve important roles in the upkeep and function of the environment where they live in. So in some ways, they remind me of our local HDB apartments. They can actually host many different small marine animals on coral reefs. And the presence of giant clams generally suggests that the reefs are healthy and the communities are also healthy, as because they offer a diverse range of ecological functions towards supporting the reef biodiversity. And from a cultural significance perspective, giant clams have been a traditional coastal resource for more than a millennium, and they are harvested as a food source of food and also for their shells as a material. The entire giant clam can be eaten, except for their kidneys and the shells. So that explains why one of the current major drivers of local extinction appears to be overexploitation of the clams as a coastal resource. In various coastal communities, giant clams do have a very important social and cultural standing. But also, like many other marine species, they are globally threatened by direct and indirect impacts caused by humans. So more critically, many of the studies over the years have agreed that giant clams are declining and threatened in many parts of their geographic range. So of course, other people or many others can argue that isn't many other marine animals, marine species also globally threatened? Well, that is mostly true. But for me, I also argue that these massive charismatic bivalves can also help to champion on behalf of the many other overlooked invertebrates. And invertebrates are basically species or animals that do not have a spine or an obvious spine. So like us, we are called vertebrates because we have a proper spine. And many of these overlooked invertebrates, they don't look cute and cuddly as well. So think of it as like when you conserve large megafauna these days, one of the considerations is also to protect its home and habitats. And by doing so, the conservation of an iconic species like the giant clam will and can benefit other marine life living with these bivalves as well. So it's by extending an additional protection around these giant clams also. So my passion for these giant bivalves have propelled me to research them to death in Singapore, in the words of my supervisor, which have prompted me to ask myself, what is next? So unlike many of my PhD peers, I spent my entire education career and research in sunny island, Singapore. And what's actually quite surprising to many people that I still speak to today is completing a PhD in marine biology right here in Singapore. So at the end of my PhD, I also asked myself, heck, what am I going to do with a PhD on just clams itself? So, but at the same time, I also saw a great potential applying what I have learned in Singapore to other places in the world that still have healthy populations or reasonable populations of giant clams. So my question next to myself was, how do I globetrot the world and send my message across to the researchers and conservation managers? So you may think that globetrotting could be like just traveling around and diving in the sea and studying them, like living the life out at sea. But unfortunately for me, it wasn't quite like that. It was instead me taking my research from conference to conference and talking about it to different audiences. I remember having many mixed feelings after each conference because after attending some of them, they made me feel like my research was not interesting because, there wasn't many people in the audience and there wasn't many questions after I gave my talk. And others felt a little bit lonely because, I was unable to find any other fellow colleagues who are interested in the topic that I was studying or interested in the animal that I was studying as well. But, I think what really helped was just persisting and continuing my search of people who are interested, that just presenting my work after work at different conferences around the region. And it was also very helpful when I was also concurrently applying for different funding to do more work on giant clams itself as well. So with slowly and steadily over time, opportunities and people came along who, saw the value of my work and who saw potential in the work and gave me more opportunities to help, do my research, but also boost the profile for giant clams. So to cut to the chase, I had a lot of great collaborators over the time who gave me opportunity, who gave me funding, when the times were difficult. And I'm glad to share that it has somewhat paid off over the years. And at this point, I like to say that I don't really see myself as being very much more successful with conservation grants as I was 6 years ago. But I feel what I have done for myself is to build a much stronger network of peers who believe in the work that I do and the cause that I'm trying to champion for as well. And so my globe-trotting days with giant clams had me working with various different researchers all over the world. You can see the different dots appearing on this global map shows you where are the different people that I've been working with. I'm really happy to actually meet them and vice versa, be able to share my work and also listen to what they have been doing. Through this process, I've also advanced giant clam science in the different locations. There's also capacity building of expertise and skills with my colleagues. It has been an incredible career journey for me just with the giant clams itself, working very hard from day one to prove myself, but also the conservation value and worth of giant clams. Of course, from a scientist, you might have heard a bit of this phrase called publish or perish. It's a very common phrase used in academia because we have to constantly be publishing papers. If not, we'll perish in that sense or have the lack of research funding. But I think beyond that, I think it's more about gaining that friendship through the different collaborations that I've built. That have built even more research pathways for me as I go along this journey. And that has actually also brought me onto this newer research path with my colleagues at the National Marine Lab, where we were all interested in advancing the science of mariculture. So mariculture itself is the study of cultivating marine organisms for the purpose of food, research, conservation, aquarium trade, and a lot of other reasons as well. So this work allows us to study the babies of marine animals, which are very important stepping stones in ensuring the species survival. Usually, mariculture focuses on species with very high commercial value or conservation interest as well. And it is generally very hard work because your marine animals don't always cooperate. And I think many people don't quite realize that actually mariculture work requires a lot of skills in cleaning. So meaning that like you spend a lot more time cleaning your tanks than actually diving in the sea. So we know that marine biodiversity refers to life under the sea, and we know that they can provide and support many ecological and economical services as seen here. But on the other spectrum, there are also a growing number of impacts on these marine resources. And these impacts are driven by us, humans. So to keep up with our increasing demands for resources, the impacts now far exceed the ecosystem services that can be provided by the marine biodiversity. And just right here in Singapore, we're already seeing a lot of these impacts. And where some of our more iconic species like the hard coral, the giant clam, and cowrie snails, they are becoming rarer with time. So our community of marine researchers often use these animals for experiments to understand the effects of localized impacts, such as increased seawater temperatures on the occurrence of bleaching. So bleaching means that the organisms would eventually turn white because of the loss of a particular algae from its body. So for this particular project, we chose organisms that share very common traits. As you can see here, they are not just often used in marine science research, but these are all animals that build very strong carbonate structures or skeleton. So we know that the coral itself, it's not a rock, it is still a live animal, but the bulk of a coral is made up of the carbonate skeleton. Similarly, for the giant clam and the cowrie, their shells are very heavily calcified, which makes them one of the common traits that we're looking across these animals. They are also very popular in the marine ornamental aquarium trade. So if some of you are actually keeping marine animals in your aquarium tanks, you would be very familiar with some of them as well. And generally in the wild, their populations are endangered. And so our project is unique because we want to provide tropical marine species, not just as a research model organisms that will produce relevant data for our region. But at the end of it also is to see if some of these animals can feed into other types of applied research. So just as an example, there is a professor based in NTU, Professor Ali Mizeres. He had studied the mechanical strengths of byssal threads produced by seashells, like the giant clam itself. So this animal here that you see right here, you can see that it's fully burrowed into the seabed, into the coral rock, and not just burrowed, but it's also attached very strongly using very strong fibrous threads as well. So that's the thread that this professor was studying. He was looking at the tensile strength of these threads. So moving on to our project, we propose how, in a way, we can build up the mariculture capabilities for these three marine animals mentioned earlier. And the goal of it is to produce organisms that will eventually feed into the research, the conservation, and the aquarium trade. And in particular, for the last pillar, which is the aquarium trade, we want to emphasize that the study is not just the feasibility of being able to supply cultured animals to the aquarium traders, but to also develop a reliable marking system that could help to differentiate illegally wild-caught individuals versus cultured ones. So currently, a lot of the marine animals that you see in the aquarium trade are most likely illegally caught from the wild, especially those that are protected under under certain laws. So we want to be able to use marking systems that can effectively or more efficiently differentiate which ones come from the wild and which ones come from the cultured sources as well. So currently this project is already in its final year. So when we used to present this, it was still early stages, but basically there are some knowledge gaps that we felt that we could answer through this project itself. For example, what are the data on the organisms growth in Singapore water conditions, and also how do we actually effectively do scaling? Can we scale up the cultures in the lab? And also to understand whether it is possible to use certain tools to tag and track marine animals in the very lucrative aquarium trade. So these are the two major aims of the project: advancing the methods and developing novel techniques for tagging and tracking. So we want to target two parts to it as well: the supply and the demand. And the demand will fit into the 3 pillars that I talk about. And very specifically for the aquarium trade, we are working with a local partner, which is the National Parks Board that you all might be familiar with. It is the current agency in Singapore that looks after the environmental issues in Singapore. So we are working closely with them to engage with the industry, which is the aquarium traders, and see how we can actually bridge the knowledge between 2 parties and what are the positives and what are the negatives that are happening right now in the aquarium trade that can be improved through tagging and tracing of the animals. Here. So that sums up the mariculture project. And then that moves on to something that I have never done before. In fact, throughout my career, I've always worked with living marine organisms for my experiments, for my research, and for my surveys as well. But this opportunity came up during the pandemic, which was a joint research funding between the UK and Singapore to undertake the study of marine plastic pollution around Singapore and the region. So I think some of you might be passionate about this topic in your own way, or also have been very acutely aware because of the various new initiatives that are taking place right here in Singapore. But we know that this topic has been trending, especially because international bodies recognize it as a global problem caused by human populations. We know that the presence of marine plastics in the environment affects marine life. The large plastics can cause strangulation, and the smaller plastics can cause the obstruction of the digestive tract as well. And we know that to some extent there is a risk posed to human health. But at the same time, I think the beauty of this particular project that we're trying to see is how studying the problem could also turn into a potential solution. And what I mean by that is that when we look at the marine plastics that are present in the environment, what we're interested is actually looking at the bacteria that lives on the plastic materials. And we want to discover whether certain bacteria that are living on the plastic material could be eating and degrading the plastic material as it floats around the sea. And that is why so in this particular project, that's why we are studying something called plastisphere, which are plastic debris containing microorganisms. And we want to see how some of these microorganisms could pose a threat to us, but to also potentially discover new enzymes that can help solve the plastic problem in the long term. So to bring us back to the status of situation and how's the project doing as well. And this is a project that I like to see myself and see my team becoming from a local perspective, local scientist to a global scientist as well. So let me share with you this journey that we've been so far. So broadly, as an overview, the status of marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia, we know that it has been a region that has been underscored to be contributing very, very high levels of marine plastic pollution. There's a lot of papers, a lot of news that have been sort of pointing to Southeast Asia, primarily several different countries such as Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia are said to cumulatively contribute more than 25% of the world's plastic pollution in the ocean. However, I think one of the issues that we have right now is that we don't really have a very good consolidated understanding of the plastic pollution, not just microplastic, but plastic pollution across the coastal environments. And we know that because a lot of the estimates that we have right now focuses on the big plastic litter. So therefore, in this project, we have 3 broad aims. We want to actually develop an understanding of the region's current status of marine plastic pollution. We want to know how it is doing, in this case, because it's during the pandemic, it's a very interesting case study as well, because we have the pandemic as an additional factor. we want to also be able to what we call harmonize sampling protocols. So one of the major issues is that everyone around the world are sampling and surveying marine plastics, but they're all using very different survey protocols, which makes it very difficult for comparison. I think very simply to put, like if you're all using different methods to do a class project, you'll realize that when you try and consolidate them, it's very difficult to find a consensus because the method that you use are simply very different. And it's very similar to scientific research as well. If you use very different methods to get the results, get the data, when it comes to comparing, it's not comparing apples to apples. It's essentially apples versus oranges, which are very different, as we know. And I think the final part is to show and demonstrate how we are collaborating beyond the region on this issue. So as a key resource that my team from the Center for International Law with Ms. Yona Leons, is also based in NUS, together with myself, we developed this regional research inventory, which we call RRI 2.0. We started this initiative back in early 2019, just before the COVID, 1 year before the COVID outbreak. And at that time, the plastic pollution narrative was also very strong, and there was there was funding and there was support for it as well. So basically, over the last few years, we have been developing this inventory. We have been cataloging and inventorizing all the different research papers, not just the scientific papers, but we also included humanities-related publications as well. Examples are, from looking at from a business perspective, how do we handle marine plastic pollution, and also from the social perspective of like interviewing communities on their perspective of pollution in their coastal communities as well. And to date, we have accumulated nearly 700 different papers just from Southeast Asia alone. We feel that it is a reasonably big number of publications, considering the recent, considering that this topic is still fairly recent, and this number is growing as we speak. And I think one of the interesting thing about this particular inventory is that it does not only contain publications in English, but we want to also capture the region's native languages as well. We see it as very important because in countries such as Indonesia and Indonesia and Thailand, these are two countries that have local journals that they publish in their local languages. So we actually worked with our collaborators, with different regional researchers, to actually translate the results and input it into this inventory as well. So I just wanted to show you all a little bit of the results. And if you are interested to look at how this beta version website looks like, you can actually access it through this link, maple-riv.web.app. But very broadly, I just wanted to highlight some interesting results that we see from the region itself. So when we look at the different plastic size classes, so it's very interesting that microplastics stand out as the dominant number of papers that reports microplastics. So earlier on, just one slide ago, remember I mentioned how most of the data about the status of plastic pollution in the region is about the larger litter, macroplastics. But what's interesting is that in fact, actually 400 over papers are about microplastics, and yet there's no mention or no talk about it as well. And if we look at the types, the shape of the particles, so you might have a question or quick question for me right now here is like, why do shapes matter? They do because they do give you an indication of where these particles may come from. And if these particles are originally microplastics already, so for instance, your microbeads in your facial moisturizers or facial wash, versus microplastics that have been broken down by the natural conditions in the sea. So therefore, these shapes or an indication of the shapes gives you an idea of where these plastics may come from. And similarly, for the polymers, which is the chemical composition of these plastics, it can also give you a quick idea of where has come from. So most of them are actually, I think polymers are quite varied. So not just what we call PE, which is polyethylene. So I think the most common one that we are very familiar is PET, which are PET water bottles. PE is also the plastic bags that you use are a form of PE as well. So I just wanted to show you all this very quickly. And then moving on to actually what we've done in a stepwise manner is that we've communicated what we know from the inventory. And now we are actually trying to move into getting regional perspective, like what exactly is happening around in the region also. So we wanted to, through this project, we have 4 different countries, including Singapore, to do a few sampling over the pandemic and until last year, to see like how, what is the extent of plastic pollution in different habitat types. So a lot of the studies have usually focused on the beach area and the mangroves, the top 2 habitats that you see here. But there is increasing number of studies that also shows and demonstrates that how other habitats such as seagrass meadows and coral reefs are also capturing plastics at rates that we are not we haven't quite determined yet. So therefore, this we're hoping that in one of the hypotheses in this particular study is that hopefully we'll actually see a gradient of abundance across these habitats that we sampled. Just to give you an idea of how the sampling looks like in different parts of Singapore. You can see in different parts of Singapore, we did very extensive sampling. We visited a place called Lim Chu Kang, which is a mangrove. Hopefully you can see, but like you can see like some blue color lines here. So these are all straws. What was very interesting is that I think at Lim Chu Kang alone, they found about 400 over straws in one sample or in one transact. And then this is also a view or a scenery underwater. So it's a bit hard to see because these are very fine fishing line filaments, monofilaments. So these monofilaments get trapped within corals, the fishing hooks, the fishing weights, they all get trapped in the coral reefs itself. And this is just along Tanah Merah. If some of you have visited the beach around Tanah Merah or Changi, you also might see lots of litter in the form of plastic bottles and plastic trash as well. So maybe to some extent, this result isn't surprising. So between 2 different seasons, this is just sampling for one season, but you can see that from these graphs, it is overwhelmingly pink. And this pink color represents plastic, which is at the end right here. And you can see that based on numbers or based on mass, plastics always stand out as being a highly dominant material type in many of the environments that we sampled here as well. But also interesting just to highlight that we do find other materials as well, like cloth, wood, rubber, metal, glass, but it's still, minority compared to plastics. And when we look at the users, when we look at just marine plastics or plastics alone itself, you can see the variety of users, the variety of plastics that are being found in the environment. So from bottles, the smaller the bottles of less than a liter, bottles more than a liter, the caps, plastic bags. And you can see that there's no dominant items. In fact, every possible plastic item that you can find in your house, you can also find in the ocean. I think that's how I would summarize it as well. Of course, there is the one that I mentioned earlier about the straws. So that was a unique sort of observation that was only found in one environment at that particular point in time as well, which is highlighted by the yellow triangle right here. So those results are still ongoing. We have not concluded our studies and results yet. But I'll be happy to discuss, or if you have any questions about what I found so far, we can actually take it as a discussion point later. But I wanted to really show you something that came out again as an opportunity through another funding source that I became a fellow for. So earlier last year in 2021, I was given what we call the Pew Marine Fellowship, which allowed me to do more research about the giant clams. So just last year, I had attended the very first annual meeting with the other Pew Marine Fellows, and I had the opportunity to meet one of the greats, Professor Martin Thier, who has been studying this marine plastic issue over the last 20 years based in the University of Chile. And he was starting off this particular 3-month-long project, which is called Ocean Travelers. And it is actually a citizen science survey project that looks at understanding how often do we find marine litter that is covered with marine life. And he was looking for different research partners around the world. And I was really happy to, hear about this project. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? We can do it right here in Singapore as well. Although I did highlight to him that Singapore isn't very big. And whether the results that we have, are we too closely, are the sites too closely located between each other? I mean, compared the coast of San Francisco, where we were at having the meeting, versus Singapore, I think San Francisco has a much longer coast. But he said that, it's possible, as long as they are at least 1 or 2 kilometers apart, we should be fine. So in this project, I did it with my colleague. We went out sampling, we did sorting. It's a very interesting project. They basically taught us how to create a marine litter lab in our lab in this case. So we did a cataloging and we actually found interesting stuff. I thought that one of my perspectives that came out from this project is that in the previous part of the work that I shared with you, we were just busy collecting litter. We were just counting them and we were not looking at them very closely for anything else. We were just interested if they were plastic, they were a bottle, and how many of them can we find in the environment. But through this project, it made me realize that we should actually take a closer look at some of them as well, especially because how the marine life that you see living on some of these materials can give you an idea how long has this slipper been in the ocean, have been floating in the ocean for a while. Because, for instance, if these are white patches that you see here are what we call tube worms. And the size of the tube worm, the species of the tube worm, we know that to some extent there are already certain data about their lifespan. So we know through that lifespan, we can estimate how old this slipper has been in the ocean. And that gives us an idea of how long these materials last in the waters as well. So finally, to sum up everything that I've shared today, is that what I have been trying to do is to take a multidisciplinary approach to improve the information for marine conservation issues. So while I mostly focus on a lot of the issues around, from experimental to field surveys to taxonomy and the laws, I think importantly is to also kind of circle it back to science communication as well. And many of the work that I do through how do I do communicating of science is, I write articles and commentaries for blogs and newspapers. I also see myself as, having gone over the years to have become a reasonable expert to serve as a scientific expert in interviews, and also to still be continually giving talks to schools and public and to yourself here today, graciously giving me your time to listen to my talk today as well. Hopefully, to some extent, after introducing myself and my work, I have given you all an inkling of asking this question of okay, if I want to do something for the ocean, what can I do? I do feel that you don't have to be a scientist to make a difference. Everybody has a role to play in advocacy by choosing what works best for yourself. It may be just empowering yourself by being informed with the right information. We talk about combating fake news and building public trust through understanding the issues better. If you have more time, you can volunteer your time with many of the different organizations that we have right here in Singapore. And finally, also just talking about the issue, lend your voice to the cause. The major reason why I say I'm using my voice to champion for marine conservation is that a lot of environmental issues, a lot of the marine animals and plants, and they don't have that voice. They don't have that voice to speak up for themselves. And I think that's where I come in, or that's where I feel I can contribute towards towards their protection and towards helping them in the longer run as well. So I think the bottom line is we all can do something for the oceans that works best for us. And I want to leave you all some words of wisdom from my professor, Professor Chow Lok Meng. He's our pioneer marine conservationist in Singapore, and many of us in the marine community respects him very much. And very recently, he has been named as the ASEAN Biodiversity Champion for Singapore. And these words that he has given me a very, very deep impression, which is corals here in Singapore have not given up on hope. So we should not give up on them. And I think it's very true in many sense. If in a way that we still have corals here for us to study, we still have corals here for us to protect in the long term. And essentially, I think this still gives me a lot of optimism to continue what I do, because I think there's still hope to reverse the tides and protect what we have in Singapore. And it is true that marine conservation should start from home, right here in Singapore. And I think for me, that has also extended my journey to my children, my newfound source of motivation, because I want to hopefully do them right by leaving a positive environmental legacy so that they can enjoy and be proud of. So education for them, for me, also starts right here in my home. So with that, I also like to conclude my presentation. Again, thank you everyone for your kind attention. And I think we have ample time for Q&A. And I hand the time back to Rodel. And I didn't catch the other lady who was giving the announcement, but yes, thank you so much for the introduction earlier as well.